All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to talk about one single sermon from way back in 1844 that basically dropped a theological bombshell. I mean, it challenged centuries of how Christians thought about the very nature of God. And at the heart of it all is this really powerful kind of cryptic couplet. As man now is, God once was. As God now is, man may become. This idea, which is totally central to what's known as the King Follet Discourse, suggests something absolutely radical about the potential for both God and for us. So today, we're going to explore what that really means and where on earth it came from. So to really get why this idea was such a big deal, we have to start with a puzzle, a paradox really, that's buried deep inside the Bible itself. It's all about this seemingly contradictory picture of who God is. So on the one hand, you've got verses like this one from Malachi, "For I am the Lord, I change not." This is pretty much the foundation for the idea of a perfect, constant, totally unchanging God. Seems pretty clear-cut, right? But then you flip over to a passage like this one in Exodus, where it says God repented. He changed his mind because of what Moses said. And look, this isn't some tiny detail. It's a huge shift in action, and it's all based on a relationship. And, well, this is it. This is the big question theologians have been wrestling with for centuries. Is God this fixed absolute being who is totally unaffected by anything we do? Or is God dynamic, relational, someone who actually engages with us in real time? Which one is it? Now, for most of Western history, there's been one dominant answer to that question. It's what we call the classical view. The key concept here is something called immutability. And this is super important. It doesn't just mean God's character is consistent, like he's always loving. No, it means nothing about God can change, period. Not his mind, not what he knows. He can't even be affected by emotions like our grief or joy. He's totally unchanging. Now, here's what's so fascinating. Where did this idea really come from? It wasn't just from reading the Bible. It was actually heavily influenced by ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. See, for them, perfection meant being static and unchanging. Later on, brilliant thinkers like St. Augustine came along and just masterfully wove these Greek ideas right into the fabric of Christian theology. Okay, but what if there's another way to look at all this? This brings us back to that alternative idea from the King Follet Discourse, a perspective we can call the dynamic engagement view. This comparison really lays it all out. On the left, you have the classical view. Any change at all is seen as an imperfection. But look at the dynamic engagement view on the right. It makes a really crucial distinction. It says God's character, his love, his justice, his mercy, that's what's unchanging. But his relationship with us is totally dynamic, active, and responsive. So in this view, perfection isn't being stuck in place. It's about having the capacity for a perfect, real, and even growing relationship. You see? This completely reframes the whole debate. The question isn't just, does God change, yes or no? It becomes, what about God is the unchanging part? Is it his entire state of being frozen in time, or is it his core character and his ultimate purposes? That's a very different question. Okay, and this is where the story takes a really fascinating twist. For more than 100 years, Joseph Smith's idea was pretty much dismissed as radical heresy, but then, in the 20th century, a bunch of really prominent theologians, people with no connection to his church, started exploring ideas that sounded, well, a lot like his. So first up, you've got Ernst Benz. He was a German Protestant theologian, and he really dug into this stuff. And his conclusion was pretty stunning. He argued that what Joseph Smith was teaching wasn't some crazy new invention. He thought it was actually a restoration of an older idea, a more dynamic view of God that was closer to what the earliest Christians believed, before all that Greek philosophy took over. Then there's Jürgen Moltmann. He looked at that classical idea of an impassive God, a God who can't be affected by anything, and he just completely rejected it. He argued for a suffering God, a God who is right there with us, deeply involved in human history and feeling our pain. And this quote from him just hits so hard. A God who cannot suffer is a deficient God. For Moltmann, a God who's distant and can't be touched by our reality wasn't more perfect, he was actually less perfect. He believed true perfection had to include the ability to love, which means it also has to include the ability to suffer. And even more recently, you have theologians like John Sanders pushing an idea called open theism. Basically, it says that if our free will is real, truly real,
then the future has to be at least partly open, even for God. And if that's true, it means God is in a genuine give-and-take relationship with us, responding and adapting as we make our choices and as history unfolds. So when you start putting all these pieces together, a really striking picture starts to form.
Just look at this timeline for a second. You've got Greek philosophy setting the stage for a static god way back around 400 BC. That idea gets cemented into Christian theology around 400 AD, and it stays the dominant view for over 1,500 years. Then, boom, 1844, Joseph Smith gives the King Follet Discourse. It's written off as totally radical. But then, fast forward over a century, and you see guys like Moltmann and Sanders, mainstream theologians, independently starting to push back against that same classical tradition, arguing for a God who sounds way more dynamic and relational. And here's the real takeaway. An idea that was once considered complete heresy is now a serious, growing conversation inside mainstream theology. It's almost like modern theologians are starting to rediscover and argue for the very same kind of dynamic, relational God that was described in that King Follet Discourse so long ago.
Which leaves us with one last, pretty provocative question. Was the King Follet Discourse just a total outlier, a radical break from Christian thought? Or was it a restoration of a much older truth, a concept revealed way ahead of its time, more than a century before the rest of the theological world was even ready to start asking the right questions? That's something to chew on.